Okay, welcome. Thank you all for coming to hear about power and truth, two big topics. I'm John Baskin. I'm an editor of the magazine called The Point, a magazine of philosophical essays based in the United States. And I'm honored. I'm honored to be here with Stephen Lukes, a professor of sociology. Stephen is a professor of sociology at New York University, formerly a fellow of politics and sociology at Oxford. He's the author of several notable books, including an acclaimed intellectual history of Emile Durkheim, a study of the political and intellectual concept of individualism, and also a highly praised novel framed as a modern update on Candide entitled The Curious Enlightenment of Professor Caritat. Professor Lukes' study of power, which is entitled Power, A Radical View, and published in 1973, is still a landmark work in academic theory about power and will be of obvious interest to us today as we explore the relation between power and truth, which is one subject of a new collection of essays he's working on. There's a lot more I could say about Professor Lukes, but we've got to get to the bottom of power and truth. So to set up this discussion, Professor Lukes asked me to start by reading two quotations from the famous essay by Hannah Arendt, Truth and Politics, an essay she originally published in The New Yorker in 1967. The first quotation, which is the second sentence of the essay, is, "No one has ever doubted that truth and politics are on rather bad terms with each other, and no one, as far as I know, has ever counted truthfulness among the political virtues." And the second, which comes a few sentences later, is sort of the question that structures the essay. She asks, "Is it of the very essence of truth to be impotent, and of the very essence of power to be deceitful?" So I think to read these things now, it's easy to immediately think of political situations we're all familiar with, including in the country we live in the United States, and things we've heard all weekend about, governments in Russia, and the sort of, we just heard about Hungary. And this idea, there's an idea, at least in the sort of liberal press a lot of the time, that one of the problems in these governments is that there's an assault on truth and facts. Timothy Snyder said on Friday that, we've had this retreat from factuality and we need to reassert factuality in our politics. And there's sort of an idea that if we could return these politicians to the facts, we would be better off and people would see the error of their ways. I guess in view of these Arendt quotes about the sort of incompatibility of truth and power, and there's a long political philosophical history of thinking about politics in terms of power more so than truth, I sort of wanted to start with a sort of counterintuitive question of sort of what makes us think that politics has anything to do with truth, and what are the different roles that truth plays in different kind of ideas of politics?
Is this working?
I don't know.
Yeah, okay. So these are big questions, these are big concepts. I mean, or rather, there are concepts which we could spend a lot of time, but I'm not going to do that, being pedantic. What do we mean by power? What do we mean by truth? But just to respond to what you just said, why should politics have anything to do with truth? Well, I mean, I think that let's make a distinction between truth with a small t and big truth with big capital T. So, and so big truth would be like metaphysical truths, truths about the human condition, truth about what life is about, truths that are about moral and religious issues. And then there's small truths, which just have to do with how many people attended Trump's inaugural? Or how many Muslims live in France? I mean, factual questions. Or actually included in the same category, I'd say questions like, is climate change happening? Questions that scientists argue about. So let's make a distinction between small truths and big truths. Now, if we talk about big truths, politics has certainly had to do with that, with these big truths. And since we're discussing Hannah Arendt, in part, she certainly was very, not in this essay, not in these quotations, but she was certainly very preoccupied by the idea that politics could be about the imposition of truth, with big T, upon whole societies. I mean, that's what totalitarianism was. It was the successful imposition of big truth. And so there certainly is a history of politics being about that. And I would say liberalism, and certainly liberal democracy, is about ways of organizing political life in which those questions remain open and a matter of controversy and contest between different groups, different people, different kinds of people. So liberal democracy is about holding big truth questions in abeyance, or rather having a kind of, I suppose, let's say, impartiality, even neutrality, though that's always problematic, in which the state and political life is a matter of not imposing big truth on everybody. But if we're talking about small truths, that's to say, and really they're not so small, truths about how the world works, the product of science and social science as well, then I think politics, if your question is, should politics be concerned with that, my answer is, of course, because if it isn't, it's not going to be effective.
Well, but I mean, I guess this is a question of what effective politics is, because Trump, obviously, in some regard, has been quite effective, and he has very little regard. I mean, effective in the sense of winning, and he has very little regard for small truth in this sense, in the sense of facts. And you quote this new book by Amanda Carpenter, she's the author of a new book, a forthcoming book called Gaslighting America. And she says that many who vote for Trump, confronted with evidence of falsehoods he tells, do not see deception, they see commitment to winning.
Right.
And I guess there's a question, I mean, is it a valid form of politics to say, I'm not going to let the truth get in the way of winning? I mean, isn't that, from the purely political perspective, a reasonable thing to do?
Yeah, well, this raises the other part of what I certainly want to say. I mean, it's obviously, you're right, that Trump and Republicans who are kind of slavishly following him are fully engaged in befuddling people, in telling lies. Actually, I think it's worse than that. It's more what we could call bullshitting, in the sense it's getting people it's not just lying to people, it's getting people to somehow accept. That's what gaslighting means, I suppose. Accept the fact that they're told lots of lies and it kind of doesn't matter. So it's true that Trump and the Republicans have been doing this. But on the other hand, whether that's going to work over the long term, we'll see. But as for politics, I think that politics is one way of thinking about politics is to ask what it is, which is what Hannah Arendt is raising here. And one way of thinking about politics is just to see it in a very reductive way as like war, in which the only issue is to win. And that's the way Trump is clearly operating. And that's the way Republicans are operating right now. That's to say, politics is just a game in which, very serious game, in which the point is to defeat the enemy, is to defeat the other side. So polarization is the name of the game. And there you can manipulate people, or rather you can manipulate truths in such a way that doing that is part of what you do. That's part of the game. Yes, I think if you think that politics is just a matter of winning at all costs, then you can for a time, just treat small truths as entirely, up for grabs.
And so this is, you develop in some of your notes for this chapter, this idea of why politics in this respect is different from some other realms that are concerned with truth. For instance, journalism or the judiciary.
So what I think is this. I think that, truths, and I call them small truths, of course they're very important, big truths in the sense that, by small truths I mean truths about how the world works, empirical truths, factual truths. So I think one way to think about what makes politics different is this way. I think that there are various, let's call them fields. I use that term in the sense in which Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, used it. Fields being areas of life in which people are both cooperating and competing with each other, competing for resources, but also for reputation, in which the search for truth, ways of arriving at truths, are the name of the game. That's what you do. So in science, for instance, scientists gain success by arriving at theories which other scientists acknowledge to be true, or at least acknowledge to be better than what existed before. So science is a field in which truth is what they are, you could have endless discussions about this, but I'm trying to simplify. I think science is about tracking truths. And looking for evidence, or rather finding theoretical answers to questions where evidence is crucial and has to be found and not faked, not falsified. Similarly with journalism. Journalists go in for fact-checking. Real journalists who respect one another as journalists if their stories are well backed by evidence. Take the law. Law similarly has to be, if it's going to be functioning properly, an arena of life, a field in which the successful prosecutions or success in engaging in the law requires appeal to evidence. So that too is a profession that's fact-checking or factually based, because evidence matters. What I think is this, just briefly. I think politics is not a field like those, because, and this goes back to your first question of why, what politics has to do with truth. I think you can think of politics as a field of competition, in which reputations are at stake, and it's clearly a competition for resources. But the very question of what the game is itself a political question. So that if you want to engage in politics, or if you conceive that politics is really just about winning, if you take that reductive view, then you can dispense with, or you can deal with the truth question in that way. You can say, okay, I'll just lie, or I'll engage in bullshitting. So you've changed the game to that. It's just winning. And you can treat, which is what I think the Trump agenda has been, you can treat concerns with science, with truth tracking and so forth, you can treat that as something you want to discredit. So in the piece that you read, which I like to quote, which is by a speech by Rush Limbaugh, the radio shock jock, saying, we've got our own reality. They've got theirs. They being who? Scientists, academics, and so on. And we're winning. And you can find several statements by Trump supporters. Indeed, I seem to remember under George Bush, someone said something very similar, that now we're in charge of reality.
Well, actually, a quote I was going to ask you about is the Karl Rove, the advisor to President George W. Bush, who reprimanded a liberal journalist by saying, "Well, you're just part of the reality-based community."
Yeah, right, exactly.
Liberals and journalists all made fun of him and thought this was such a travesty that this administration could be so cavalier and make fun of people for being attached to reality. But there's a truth there about what politics are. He was saying, look, you're dealing with tracking reality. I'm doing something else. We're shaping reality. We're making a new reality.
Yeah. So that's what that shows is that politics, if you see it in this very wide sense, politics is a place, the place where you can actually just decide to engage in warfare and discredit these truth-tracking fields or institutions I'm talking about, which is exactly what we've been seeing in America under Trump and elsewhere, but especially in America, you can discredit whole areas of science. You can attack the law. You can attack journalism, which is and the media, and you can say, well, they don't count.
And you mentioned that Rush Limbaugh, I mean, this was in 2009, 7 years before Trump, when he named, I think it's colorful, the four corners of deceit, being academia, public administration, journalism, and science, maybe. I don't. So I mean, I think that this question then raises a really practical question. You mentioned that we have there's a sort of, in terms of the struggle over what politics are right now, there are sort of two sides, at least in the American context. There's the sort of deliberative liberal democratic concept of politics, which still has there's an important place in that concept of politics for these transpartisan authorities that have some standards of truth which are not necessarily guided by politics, whereas this sort of right-wing politics that Limbaugh represents has been focused on discrediting those authorities for a long time, and to some degree of success, obviously. So then there's a question, sort of, how does the deliberative, when there's sort of an asymmetric, as you call it, attack on these institutions from the other side, does the deliberative liberal concept, how does it respond?
Well, before we get there, because that's the big practical question, what's the implications of all this for how we should act, or how what kind of politics we should engage in? But just before we get there, I'd just like to say, this is I think where we are. I mean, I think in the one way I agreed very much with Tim Snyder. We are in a new kind of situation now, relatively new, in which the contest that goes on, that historically always went on for a century, I mean, between left and right in various ways, that was a contest between what Chantal Mouffe calls adversaries. Adversaries being people who are opposed to one another, who are fighting one another even, but who are playing the same game, who are engaged in a kind of contest in which there is, at some serious level, a mutual recognition that they're part of the same game, in which you concede defeat, if you're defeated, and in which winning is playing by the rules of that game. However, you could make the distinction, which she does, I think it's very helpful, between adversaries and enemies. Enemies don't care about what the rules are. In fact, enemies are quite willing. I mean, the point about an enemy is you win at all costs. And that, I think, I may be wrong, but it does seem to me that has entered into the center of our politics in a way that is new. So that in Trump's America now, and I think you see this very clearly, I have to say, in the most recent business with the Supreme Court, the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh, that the Republicans there, until now, seem to just be determined to win at all costs. And that idea, in other words, winning at all costs, is the name of the game now. In the name of the game, I use the phrase deliberately. In other words, you've changed the game. It's no longer a game between adversaries. It's a game in which one side is determined to win at all costs. And the other side, and this comes to your question, is then posed with the question, well, if you're on the other side, that's to say you're in some sense committed to liberal democratic institutions, you're, let's say, on the left, you're progressive, whatever terminology you want to use, what do? Do you go onto a war footing? Or do you, in some way, try to, develop a strategy and tactics which, in some way, prefigure or represent and prefigure the kind of society you want, and in particular, a liberal democratic framework?
And what's the answer? I should say, I think this is it's a really concrete issue that comes up in so many different contexts. And you were just talking about the Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court thing. There's, as a liberal, who watched what the Republicans did when President Obama nominated a Supreme Court judge and they just ignored it and refused to vote on him. There's a part of you that thinks, it's tempting to think we should just do anything to block that, whatever rules we have to break, it doesn't matter, whatever lies we have to tell, abstracting from the individual case of what has come up. But you might just think, look, it's justifiable. They did this, and there are a lot of people that feel that way. But that would not be a prefigural politics necessarily in the way you're thinking of. Right.
Well, I'd love to know what other people think about this. I think in the end, if you want my, as it were, most reflective or something thought about this, I think that in a way it does in the end depend upon how, at some deep level, how optimistic you are about people. If you really have a dark vision, and you think, as I think actually Foucault did, that, that in the end it is all the matter of, Foucault even says politics is civil war. That's what we have to think of it as. Another dark such vision, of course, is Carl Schmitt. If you think that in the end it's all about friends and enemies, then I guess the answer is yes, you go on a war footing. If you're on the left, why not? What I think is true, by the way, I want to say this just as in parenthesis. It's not as though I don't think, I do actually think we are all tribal. We've become very tribal. And that's to say, I think that the idea that we are, living in our own cocoons or bubbles or silos or whatever people call them, that's true. But I also think that there's a point to being, that if you're on, let's say, on the left, or more importantly, which is what's at issue here, if you believe in liberal democracy as the best kind of framework within which to conduct politics, if you think that, as I do, I've never used the word liberal in my life, I don't think as a term of abuse. If that's your position, then to succumb to this view of politics, to engage in win-at-all-costs strategy is entirely self-defeating.
Do you have a view of why you think there has been this shift in the last, going back to 2009 or a bit before that, what has sort of, just as an analytical matter, what has changed, or has things changed in American politics or in the politics of some parts of Europe as well that have sort of thrown the game of politics into debate in the way that it seems to be? It's not something I remember, from my childhood in the 90s. There was this sense that we'd reached a kind of consensus.
Well, to remind you, at the end of the 90s, there was this book by Fukuyama, The End of History. Somehow liberal democracy had triumphed, and maybe just kind of short-term vision or something. But just if you think back to then, there has been a kind of tectonic shift, I think. Certainly, living in America, it's very clear to me. The question of why, how to explain it, this is such a huge set of questions. I have no particular answer to give, except maybe to think about what what some people call the exhaustion of the left social democratic project, which obviously has a lot to do with the end of communism as the alternative left project, which was defeated by history and which then left the social democratic project, let's call it, which of course in a way exhausted itself by its own success, in some ways you could say. But the whole, what explains it is such a large set of questions. But what I do think, which is really getting to the central point you just made, I think politics has become asymmetrical in this way, that until, let's say, 10 years ago, it was really about left and right in various forms, though left-right is a European distinction. Something like that also existed in the States too. But since then, and now speaking specifically about the States, but I think it's true elsewhere too, it's becoming asymmetrical in the sense that one side are really engaged in this politics of win at all costs, so that changing the game to a game of just winning, a Schmittian game, if you like, is what they are up to. And the left, or the liberals, or whatever you want to call us, are faced with the very question you just raised.
I wonder, just one more, and then we can open it up to people. But we were just watching this presentation about Hungary, and he was talking about the way that the right wing there, or the ruling party now, has created a sort of parallel public sphere of media and intellectuals. And clearly something similar has happened in America over the last 20 years with Fox News, and in one end, but even on the intellectual level too, that there are publications now that sort of, where there are just clear partisan publications on the right. I wonder if you could talk about, just separable from being a politician or an activist, as a public intellectual who has certain kinds of sympathies, what you see as your role at a time like this in relation to politics and truth.
Well, I mean, about my role, but I do think one implication of what I believe is that these fields that I talk about, science and journalism and the law, and indeed public administration, these are in desperate need, I think, in America, of defense, of defense and self-defense. I mean, they're all under siege, not only from politics, as we see when you see the abandon with which Trump and his political acolytes are attacking whole institutions. I mean, not just ignoring, what scientists tell us about climate change, and attacking, the fake news, the press, as just, totally not to be believed, not to be trusted, and as for the law, the total disregard that the Trump administration has for legal processes, and manipulates it without restriction, and also in public administration, where he appoints into the as leaders of the various, as heads of the various departments of state, people who are totally opposed to the very missions of these very institutions. So there's an onslaught attack, but in any case, there are other reasons, other complicated reasons why all these institutions, think about journalism, are under siege. Partly to do with the market, for example. So all these things mean that these, what I call truth-tracking institutions or fields, have to not just defend themselves and be protected and be defended. They have to survive for any decent politics to proceed. And so I think, anyway, my first sort of response to your question is something like defend the fields, defend these institutions, because they're the necessary basis for any functioning liberal democratic politics.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I think one of the implications of the kind of political situation we're in, where there's this notion of politics as war, it spreads outward into those fields.
It does,
sometimes,
yes.
and not only because they're being corrupted from the right, but there's a pressure on you, as a journalist or as a public intellectual to become more activist in response. And I'd wonder if you feel that's something I feel sometimes, this sense of, or the question of how you respond to that.
Right. But I think journalists have to be, or I don't have to be, but I'm thoroughly in favor of activist journalists, but they have to be activist journalists. And you mentioned Fox News before. One way of summarizing part of what I'm saying anyway is to say, they aren't journalists. They're propagandists.
Right. But sometimes it could be hard to tell the difference. Not in that case, but okay. Well, do we want to open it up to questions?
Thank you. In trying to come to terms with this darkness that is kind of casting a shadow over Europe and the United States, it's occurred to me that perhaps this is the default, the narrative, the main narrative after all, and that our surprise is that we've been living in kind of a pretend world.
Sorry, the what?
We've been living in a kind of a pretend world. Since 1920, let's say, when democracy became widespread in Europe, we've seen that liberal democracies fall. By 1933, there were very few liberal democracies left in Central and Eastern Europe. They were authoritarian, autocratic. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking that it's perhaps the space that America has taken up with its Commonwealth or empire that's created a kind of a false surge of acceptance of its values, but now it's receding back to its norm, which is tribal, authoritarian, nationalistic.
That is indeed a dark thought. In other words, your idea is that we had a kind of respite, the 30 glorious years or something, of a period when we suffered the illusion that somehow liberal democracy had a future, but that now we're reverting to... But isn't your vision of history a little bit foreshortened? The 19th century was not such a disaster, was it? And what about the Enlightenment? Do we have to just somehow think that the fascist years were the historic norm? I don't know.
Just one more thing. We saw a liberal democracy fall in France in 1848 and here in Vienna in the 1890s with the coming of mass participation in politics.
Yeah.
Or we saw ugly sides of it appear in Vienna around 1900.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure I'm going to pursue these dark thoughts, but we should perhaps. Yeah.
So as a follow-up on that, I wonder, at the beginning you made this distinction between sort of big moral truths and factual or small or medium-sized truths. And you sort of said deliberative liberalism puts the moral truths, suspends them, says we're not going to decide that.
Yeah.
And I wonder, following up on this question, if there's something that we're learning about people's desire to have those moral truths decided, to have a politics that speaks to them as opposed to one that puts it in abeyance, while we figure out other things.
Well, I think the putting in abeyance can never really be... it's kind of an ongoing project which can never really be successful in the sense that obviously liberal democracy is committed to liberty and democracy, so that, there are limits to this. But a well-functioning, or let's say a functioning legal system in a liberal democracy has to be one where there is something like impartiality at work. And if that's not the case, so I mean, you have to be specific here. What we mean. I mean, I think obviously the more conflictual and we're seeing that now, antagonistic a society becomes in terms of contending identities, the more these institutions are put under stress. By the way, what I think now, since I mentioned that, is what we're seeing in the United States now, I think, is something like a stress test, like banks undergo. I think we're seeing a stress test in which Trump's America is undergoing a stress test. And the piece that you referred to, that's not yet published, I actually end up with the thought that if, to be very specific, if Trump fires Rosenstein and then Mueller gets fired and everything from the Trump point of view is successful, and it doesn't matter, that's to say, people in the end just roll over, then really truth will have, in Hannah Arendt's terms, have been proved to be impotent. Sorry to be so dark, but that's what I think.
Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm David. I'm a graduate of sociocultural anthropology here. You reminded me, you spoke of Hannah Arendt, and we started actually with a quotation from her.
Yes.
She was a woman who also suffered quite significantly in her life from a political context in which a kind of new masculine cult arose. Now, both the Trump campaign and many others of the hard right recently have featured a kind of masculinity which claims to address some grievances, which there ought to be in their view. What I wonder is, since women participate just as much as men, clearly, in producing reality and bringing things about, my question would be, is it true that this masculine campaign is really addressing grievances of masculinity? Is there perhaps something to it, or do we have to do with, is this a smokescreen? Is this perhaps their own illusion? Well, that would be the question.
I can see several questions there. I'm not exactly sure what your question is. I mean, I think that, we certainly have seen, you just have to look at the television presentation of the Kavanaugh story, that whole story of of Dr. Ford and the attempt to, give her supposedly give her a platform and then basically crush her. That was masculinity plainly and fully visible at work. But your idea is what? That you're interpreting the Trump phenomenon particularly as masculine domination. Is that it?
No, it was rather whether indeed it is their right that, in a sense, masculinity is grieved, or whether, taking into account the importance of women in any social context, whether this is not really hiding much more than it tells about them, their obsession with masculinity.
Yeah. Well, I do think, I don't know how far to go down this road, but I do actually think that the Me Too movement in America and its various other exemplifications in other places which are happening and which I know too little about, is something new, and that the rise of women's voices, or the way in which they're now beginning to really have an impact, we'll have to see to what extent, will show whether you're right. I think something new is really interesting and important is happening there. Yeah, I do think that.
Thank you. A philosopher who's also taken some great deal of interest in media and especially alternative media.
Yeah.
You mentioned that media or the press as an institution needs to be protected. Unfortunately, there's also such a thing as mainstream media,
Right.
which provide lots of propaganda. And I'm not only talking about Fox News, but also about the so-called liberal or more democratic-leaning media, such as, I don't know, CNN, MSNBC. So, and those in turn provide Trump with actually legitimate ammunition for saying that the media are lying. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to, and I hope it didn't sound like that. I certainly don't mean to be idealizing or sentimentalizing what we might call the liberal press. I think actually in many ways you could say that they gave all the oxygen and all the attention to, if we're talking about Trump as I was, to the Trump success. I think they played a very large role in that. So, and you say you're interested in the alternative media. So I think that's where a great deal of the action is, of course, now. And that's part of the problem about what I have in mind about protecting the norms that you know, can in some way protect the tracking of truth. That in a way, with the rise of so-called citizen journalism and the alternative media everywhere, this becomes all the more problematical. But the idea, in other words, the idea that I'm trying to stress is that really the idea that anything goes, that you know it doesn't matter what's true or not. That's what's involved in this project of creating your own reality. That you can make the question of what is true and what evidence is. You can confuse the situation so much that people don't care anymore. And in a way, I suppose that might have been what Tim Snyder was talking about. The protection of factuality is, in part, has to be the protection of the norms and the institutions that are engaged in seeking evidence and verifying, stories.
Thank you. I'm Vin Kim. I'm from Montreal, and I was wondering, in your discussion, you haven't spoken much about technology, because what struck me is that, to be provocative, that what seems to be driving this is, as we've heard with Facebook being manipulated and so on, is that what seems to have changed the game. I mean, you've mentioned Carl Schmitt and Nazi Germany and so on, but what the difference is the difference now historically, the media. This is the new thing, the social media.
Right. No, I mean that's clearly a crucial part of what's happened, and it's part of the answer to what I think really, I don't know if you agree, but it seems to me to be a kind of tectonic, some kind of major change is happening, and that's why we are all talking in a different way than Fukuyama did now. And it's really no more than a few decades old. And technology, I mean, you're really referring to the internet, I guess.
Yes, to Facebook,
yes. And There, I mean, I think, of course, there's all kinds of... for example, I don't know if you heard Tim Sider's lecture. I thought he was far too unilateral about this. I mean, it was all really anti the internet, his version. I don't think that. I mean, I think there are all kinds of ways in which people are at least potentially more informed, better informed, and certainly able to mobilize through the internet in ways that didn't exist before. So I think it has to be a two-way story. But on the other hand, I think that we really have to, I mean, you mentioned Facebook, and you know, I'm thinking about, let's say, Cambridge Analytica, and those all of that. And there, of course, truth is very much at the center of the issues. I mean, you know, finding out what actually happened is terribly important. You've got institutions which are trying very hard to do this. For example, a committee of the House of Commons entirely devoted to fake news. In the United States, you've got, you know, the Russian inquiry. You've also got the Mueller inquiry and other things. And then you've got other people discrediting it and discounting it and saying it's not true. All that is a battle about truth. And we've got to keep in mind the idea that that's a major battle that has to go on being fought.
Do I have a hand from who that was? She right there. Back.
Thank you. Thank you for all these thoughts. And I'm afraid I'm maybe adding some more somber thoughts to the whole analysis.
Okay.
I totally agree with you that there would be a need to strengthen these norms around how truth is produced in a society. And I totally agree also that the media are a very strong field in which this happens. Yet when I look at that field, I'm under the impression that the profession of journalism already, way before, was under all sorts of pressures that took it away from there. And one of the ways in which that happened is that the logic of the market got much more embedded in this, and that what we in Europe try to see as ridiculous, the idea that you write an article to sell it, that you write in it the stuff that will sell it, instead of the beauty of the argument or the comprehensiveness of the full story, has become the standard of the profession. Those are considered the best journalists that makes the articles that sell best, that get the most of attention. And I think this creates a logic of turbulence, where turbulence generates this type of attention, and I think this is already contradictory to any truth-finding mission that might exist. So I don't think. So my idea is, would you share that analysis, or would you think I see it in a too somber way? That's the question.
I think you're completely right, and you know, a fuller discussion of all this would have had to say what you so well put so well, that all these fields, science too, actually, certainly the law. You could say that what I've offered is a kind of idealized account of how they are if they function as they should, if they function well, and clearly the marketization of the journalistic field is a crucial part of the story of its degeneration, of the ways in which journalists, to be good journalists, have to, in some way, resist the commercialization of the very activity of doing that job. But something has to survive if the phrase "being a journalist" is to mean anything. And I think you know, it does still count among journalists, doesn't it? Whether journalists recognize other journalists as being good journalists. In other words, there are norms of the profession which, of course, are constantly being undermined by the market. But the norms survive, and if they don't survive, we're in real trouble. Yeah.
I'm surprised that not only you, but of course many other intellectuals, philosophers, and so on,
Yes.
still put so much emphasis on truth. Isn't it time perhaps to recognize that the other side, you know, we are on the same side, of course, when it comes to the amount of people at the Obama or Trump inauguration. But, you know, the Trump side, Trump journalists, Holocaust deniers, creationists, Pizzagate advocates,
Yes.
climate deniers, and so on, they know the argumentation technique almost as well as our side does. Yes. In other words, they talk about facts, about real facts, about true
Alternative facts they talk about.
No. It's so that you could say, well, you know, even occasionally now when there was the hearing 2 days ago, it was her truth of Dr. And it was his truth, you know, when Kavanaugh talked, you know. So they don't talk generally about alternative facts. They talk about real facts.
They do,
about
yeah.
the real reality, yes? That was that one question. And then, of course, there you could carry on the discussion in a different way. But what I'm saying is, you know, there are amongst the climate change deniers, there are people who have got their PhD from Harvard, Princeton, etc. So there are as well a lot of intelligent people on the other side. I have dealt with creationists and all sorts of people like that. And they, you know, and when we admit that they use the argumentation technique, which has truth as its most important trick, as well as we do it, then we can say or admit that we use different examples. Now, I side, of course, with your examples, not with the example of theirs. But you can use that same argumentation technique to justify any arbitrary opinion you hold or not. So I think it's perhaps about time that we stop this talk about truth.
Really? Well, this is a very helpful question. Thank you. I mean, you said one thing there which I completely agree with, namely that there are very intelligent people on both sides. I mean, that I wouldn't dream. I mean, I'm not going to dispute that. But the thing is, I hear a hint of, more than a hint of, some sort of relativism in your question or your statement. I mean, it's true that climate deniers will say that the fact there's no climate change, or like Holocaust deniers, let's take that example, will claim to be stating truths about what happened between 1939 and 1945. But so what? I mean, the fact is, you say you side with me, but is this just a question of taking sides? Is that your view? I mean, after all, the fact that someone may make assertions about the world and about history which have no basis in evidence, indeed contradict the evidence, the fact that they claim those things to be true, so what? I mean, that doesn't mean that we have to say, well, there are alternative truths. Does it?
A short remark. I want to go so far that, of course, these Holocaust deniers, etc., and so on, they know their philosophy of science well. They can talk in Popperian terms. I have been in discussions with young Earth creationists and so on and so on. But I do believe, you know, when you talk about evidence or reality and that evidence is mute. It needs speakers here on this side, you know, of the game who talk on behalf of them. Scientists, climate change deniers, you know, in religion it's popes or theologians and so on. So the evidence is mute. You know, we speak on behalf of the evidence. They speak on behalf of the evidence, and we do. So the evidence can support both sides, you know.
Well, it's perfectly true that both sides can appeal to evidence. But look, I do want to make, you know, this can get very, very complex. But let's keep it as simple as we can provided that we go on understanding each other. I think that, you know, I made this distinction between big truths and small to medium-sized truth. You helpfully said. Okay, so if we're talking about, let's say, facts of a very straightforward kind, like how many people attended the presidential inaugural. Or we're talking about something more complicated, like is there climate change, man-made climate change? Or even more complicated things like questions about inflation and about the economy. In all these cases, evidence counts. And scientific consensus counts in the sense that you have to persuade your fellow, not only human being, but fellow scientists that the evidence supports the conclusions. Now, when you say, I mean, the examples we've just given of the Holocaust denier and the climate change, the fact is it's not the case that you've got the same kind of degree of consensus on both sides. The people who make those claims are making they're cranks. I mean, they're making claims which are not supported by the evidence. If we don't say that, and we just say, well, there are just alternative truths. I mean, there are simple-minded and there are complex ways of saying that. The complex way, I think, is Foucault's, to say there are regimes of truth, so that truth in the end is in some kind of function of power. I think if you go down that road, and I don't know whether you do, but if you go down that road, it seems to me you've given up the game. I mean, at this point, I agree. If that's what you think, we should stop talking about truth and only talk about power.
I mean, one just follow-up from what he was saying. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about truth. I mean, one of the problem, though, is I think one of the problems he was bringing up is you can make the arguments with the evidence, and they'll just give you other evidence.
That is true.
That doesn't change the fact that one thing may be true and the other isn't. But I guess one thing it brings up is the question not so much of truth as of trust.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I wondered one question sort of to, are there places where you think, where you see dialogues or things, institutions where we can build trust so that there can be a conversation about truth? I mean, isn't there kind of like a... That's
the big question. I think trust is breaking down in politics. That's another way of describing the new world we're in. I mean, it's true, just empirically. I mean, if you look at, insofar as what they're worth, if you look at, public opinion polling and all that, it's true that the level of trust in politics has been massively in decline. Just relating to this question about, people can appeal to evidence on both sides. Of course, I had an uncle who was in New York who was dealing with the claims of Holocaust survivors. And one day, a famous Holocaust denier, whose name was Butz, he invited him to his office and showed him all the files of the documentation. And Mr. Butz looked at it all and then said, "It's all hearsay." So, of course, it's always possible to resist evidence and to make these kinds of claims, but I mean, whether you're Foucault or whether you're just some kind of undergraduate attracted by relativism, if to make the move that's to say that which is what Kellyanne Conway said, that there are alternative truths, is just a road I'm not willing to go down.
Arendt actually makes this point. She says politics can destroy truth, but it can't replace it.
Right. Yeah. But of course, the Arendt essay is really just as much about big truths as small truths. And we have to make that distinction, I think.
Hi, this is such a great conversation. I want to bring it back to the metaphor of war. Politics is war. And it occurs to me, if one side is playing by the war rules, like whatever works, we're going to just go for it and we're going to destroy you.
Right.
Then you're at war. War isn't something that both sides agree, let's have one. And so if in our case in the United States, the Democrats are always trying to compromise or always trying to find some middle path, then they're just losing. For example, I just read something that the Democrats may offer a deal to Trump. You say goodbye to Kavanaugh, and we will promise that we will confirm your next person. So, in other words, Trump wins. He doesn't care if it's Kavanaugh or some other guy or gal. No. He just wants his judge there. It can be anybody.
Right.
And he would, in fact, would do better he would then get the credit for having abandoned this unbelievable misogynist rapist.
Right.
So I guess my question is, what would the argument be that the Democrats or the liberals in other situations shouldn't just go to war? So that in heaven people will say, oh, you were so virtuous, that's really great, you told the truth, and now you're all dead.
Yeah. I don't think there's a general answer to this very important question. I mean, I think sometimes you do have to go to war. Sometimes you really just have to swallow your hopes and your hopes for prefiguration and just take your gloves off. But I think as a general strategy, it has to be self-destructive. Because when that does happen, when, let's say, the left, whatever you want to call it, does actually engage in militant tactics without restraint, the outcome is never good. I mean, I think that really did happen, I have to say, as part of the history of communism. You know, Trotsky, in his famous essay, Their Morals and Ours, basically said, let's put an end to all this Quaker priestly talk. We're at war. All this liberal stuff is for, you know, people engaged in the kind of politics where, you know, you're in a kind of safe harbor. But we're at war. And I think that, you know, what you just said there is right. Maybe at a certain moment which is what I think, by the way, Michael Moore is arguing right now. Take the gloves off. Well, that's a tactical question. And maybe this Kavanaugh case is an example of it. Maybe that was a really bad deal that the Democrats made. It probably was. But then in that particular case, you have to think, well, maybe, you know, if you hold out on Kavanaugh long enough and the Democrats take the Senate, maybe we'll be able to win without sacrificing too much. In other words, I don't think there's a general answer to this. But I think as a strategy rather than tactics, taking the gloves off has to be a bad idea.
One more? Or the last one, two.
Okay, I want to come back last time to this question or this distinction between the drive to win the game and the commitment to the game and its rules. Because on the left side, you could have the comfortable position to say, well, we are losing, but at least we are playing by the rules. At least we are the good guys, whereas the other side is abandoning the rules. And on the right side, many are celebrating, but some certainly think, well, this is awful, we are winning, our side is winning, but we have abandoned the game and we have abandoned truth, which is also difficult. So I imagine on both sides there's this tension between how to deal with this situation. Maybe you have some thoughts about, or observations, how that's dealt with on both sides.
Mm-hmm. I think you put it very well. I didn't hear every word you said, by the way, but I think you put that very well. But I think that obviously in any real political movement with political leaders and people involved, you're going to have this very debate going on. And you've got it right now, for example, in America among Democrats. There are Democrat politicians who are really quite, you know, very ruthless, have very ruthless temperaments and want to go all out. There are other people who, you know, are much more, how should we say, moralistic or believing in the importance of prefigural tactics. I actually think, you know, as I said just now, I don't think we can generalize, just be really aware of the problem and not be inclined. I mean, okay, one of the things I really object to in the sort of Foucault, Carl Schmitt vision is the idea, it's a sort of reductivist idea that, you know, we can, that what really counts is winning. I think what counts is restoring, which is I think where we are right now, restoring the rules of the liberal democratic game.
There is, though, you know, you can tell from the way you set it up, there's a psychological incentive to just say, well, there are, you remove the tension if you just say the rules don't really exist anyway. Right. That there's an easiness to saying that. So, any last thoughts?
Many, but too many to summarize it.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and hopefully we can continue the discussion among ourselves.